Sometimes the greatest threat to justice isn't a criminal. It's the moment prejudice puts on a badge. The marble steps of the United States Supreme Court had witnessed generations of history, moments that shaped the nation, and decisions that changed millions of lives. On that cool Monday morning, they were about to witness something no one standing there would ever forget. Commuters hurried past with coffee cups in hand. Tourists paused to admire the towering columns. Reporters adjusted their cameras while law clerks climbed the broad staircase, carrying leather briefcases filled with case files that could influence the future of the country. Everything appeared ordinary until a single voice shattered the calm. "Sir, stop right there." Heads turned almost instantly. A white police officer stepped forward with measured confidence, his expression already convinced before a single question had been answered. Officer Ryan Whitmore had worked security assignments around federal buildings for years. Experience had taught him to trust his instincts, or at least what he believed were instincts. Standing several feet away was a tall black man wearing a tailored navy overcoat, carrying nothing more than a slim leather portfolio. His posture was relaxed, his movements deliberate, and his expression calm despite suddenly becoming the center of attention. His name was Justice Isaiah Freeman, although no one around them seemed to recognize him at that moment. He had intentionally left his official vehicle behind that morning, choosing instead to walk the final few blocks through Washington, D.C., enjoying the crisp air before what promised to be another demanding day inside the nation's highest court. It was something he rarely had time to do anymore. Officer Whitmore closed the distance. "Identification," he said firmly. Isaiah met his eyes without hesitation. "Certainly, officer." His voice remained steady, respectful, almost reassuring. But before he could fully explain who he was or why he was there, Whitmore's tone hardened. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The conversations surrounding them faded into uneasy silence. Several bystanders instinctively slowed their pace. A young law student quietly lifted a phone, uncertain whether to keep recording or simply keep walking. Isaiah never raised his voice. He never argued. Instead, he complied with every instruction, believing that patience could still create room for understanding. Yet with every passing second, the misunderstanding only seemed to grow larger. "You fit the description," Whitmore stated, offering no further explanation. Isaiah looked briefly toward the courthouse entrance, where staff members were beginning to gather at the top of the steps. He recognized several familiar faces, but they had not yet noticed him below. "Officer," Isaiah replied calmly, "there has been a mistake." The words were simple, almost gentle, but they disappeared beneath the growing attention of the crowd. Camera lenses slowly turned. Whispered conversations spread from one group to another. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, yet everyone sensed they were watching something significant unfold. Within minutes, what began as a routine encounter outside America's highest court had become the focus of dozens of witnesses, each seeing only fragments of a story that would soon dominate national headlines. Before the morning was over, one decision made in less than 60 seconds would trigger investigations, public outrage, and a civil judgment totaling $2.3 million. But standing there beneath the towering columns, with history only steps away, almost no one realized they were watching justice itself being tested before the courthouse doors had even opened. The silence lingered far longer than anyone expected. It was not the kind of silence that came from confusion alone. It was the uneasy quiet that settles over a crowd when people begin wondering whether they should intervene or simply keep watching. Justice Isaiah Freeman stood exactly where Officer Ryan Whitmore had instructed him to remain. His shoulders stayed relaxed, his breathing steady, and his eyes never left the officer speaking to him. Years spent inside courtrooms had taught him that emotion often clouded judgment, while patience could reveal far more than anger ever could. Around them, the broad plaza outside the Supreme Court continued to fill with employees arriving for the morning session. Clerks hurried toward the entrance carrying stacks of legal briefs. Security personnel exchanged greetings as they passed through the gates. Several reporters preparing for scheduled hearings noticed the growing circle of spectators and quietly redirected their cameras. Nobody understood the full story, but everyone sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Officer Whitmore glanced briefly toward the gathering crowd before turning his attention back to Isaiah. His confidence seemed to grow with every pair of eyes watching. I asked for identification, he repeated. Isaiah slowly reached toward the inside pocket of his overcoat exactly as instructed, careful to move at a pace that could not possibly be misunderstood. Before his hand could retrieve the leather credential holder, Whitmore interrupted him once again. Stop. Keep your hands visible. Isaiah immediately complied. His expression never changed. A woman standing near the courthouse steps frowned as she whispered to the colleague beside her. He has not done anything. Her companion shrugged uncertainly. Neither stepped forward. It is remarkable how quickly uncertainty can become acceptance when enough people assume someone else will speak first. Isaiah understood that reality better than most. Throughout his legal career, he had seen ordinary citizens hesitate in extraordinary moments, not because they lacked compassion, but because they feared making the wrong choice. That morning, those same lessons were unfolding outside the very building dedicated to interpreting the Constitution. A young intern working for a federal judge quietly recognized Isaiah from a judicial conference held months earlier. She took one hesitant step toward the officer before stopping herself. Her supervisor gently touched her shoulder and whispered, "Wait." Those 4 letters carried the weight of hesitation shared by nearly everyone nearby. Wait. Watch. Assume someone else knows more than you do. Officer Whitmore spoke into his radio while continuing to monitor Isaiah with unwavering suspicion. His report was brief, confident, and completely unaware of how incomplete the situation truly was. Isaiah listened without interruption. He knew that every word being spoken, every decision being made, and every reaction from the growing audience would soon matter far beyond this courthouse plaza. More phones appeared. A television photographer zoomed closer from across the street. Social media feeds quietly began filling with short clips recorded from different angles, each capturing only pieces of the encounter, but together preserving every passing minute. Above them, the American flag moved gently in the morning breeze. Beneath it stood one of the nation's highest judicial authorities, waiting with remarkable composure while strangers debated his identity without ever asking his name. Inside the courthouse, the first calendar session was scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes. Staff members were already wondering why one chair in the private conference room remained empty. No one inside could have imagined that the missing justice was only a few yards away, standing peacefully in full public view, while the misunderstanding outside continued to grow into a mistake that would soon reach far beyond one officer, one courthouse, or even one city. Officer Ryan Whitmore believed he was in complete control. Every decision he made felt justified in his own mind because he had already reached a conclusion before gathering the facts. To him, confidence looked like certainty, and certainty rarely invited questions. That confidence spread through the small group of officers responding to his radio call. Within moments, 2 additional uniformed officers arrived near the courthouse entrance. They exchanged quick glances with Whitmore before looking toward Isaiah Freeman, who remained exactly where he had been standing since the encounter began. His leather portfolio still rested calmly at his side. His expression showed neither frustration nor fear. Instead, there was a quiet disappointment that only someone who had spent decades defending the rule of law could fully understand. One of the newly arrived officers studied Isaiah for a brief moment before asking, "Has he been cooperative?" Whitmore answered without hesitation, "So far." The words sounded reassuring to everyone except those paying close attention. Cooperative. The description was accurate, yet it somehow carried the suggestion that cooperation alone was unexpected. Isaiah slowly looked toward the courthouse clock mounted above the entrance. Less than 10 minutes remained before the justices were scheduled to meet for their private conference. That meeting had been prepared for weeks. Attorneys from across the country waited anxiously for decisions that would shape lives, businesses, and constitutional debates. Inside the building, administrative staff had already begun searching for the one person who had never once arrived late without notice. Outside, the misunderstanding continued growing. Several courthouse employees recognized Isaiah from a distance, but none had a clear path through the expanding circle of spectators. The crowd had nearly doubled in size. Some whispered that the man must have done something serious. Others quietly questioned why he appeared so calm if he truly posed any threat. Human nature often searches for explanations before discovering facts, and assumptions have a way of multiplying faster than evidence. Isaiah finally spoke again, his voice carrying the same measured tone that had earned respect inside courtrooms across the nation. "Officer, I would appreciate the opportunity to identify myself." Whitmore folded his arms. That opportunity was available earlier. Isaiah paused for only a second before replying. "It is still available now." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet several people nearby later said it became the moment they realized something did not feel right. There was no hostility in Isaiah's words, no challenge to authority, no attempt to escalate the encounter, only a simple request that continued to go unanswered. Across the plaza, a legal correspondent preparing for a live broadcast recognized Isaiah's face through the camera lens. She lowered her microphone, staring in disbelief before quietly telling her producer, "Zoom in." The producer looked through the monitor, frowned, and then looked again. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Meanwhile, inside the Supreme Court building, Chief Justice Margaret Sullivan received a brief message from her clerk informing her that Justice Isaiah Freeman had not yet entered the conference room. She checked the time herself, surprised by something that had never happened during their years serving together. Without another word, she stepped away from the conference table and walked toward the main entrance, unaware that every step she took was bringing the truth closer to the courthouse doors while outside. Cameras continued recording a moment that would soon force an entire nation to confront the difference between suspicion and justice. Chief Justice Margaret Sullivan walked through the polished marble corridor with steady purpose, her footsteps echoing softly beneath the vaulted ceilings that had witnessed generations of constitutional history. She rarely left the conference room once the morning schedule began, yet something about Justice Isaiah Freeman's unexplained absence unsettled her. Punctuality had always been one of his quiet trademarks. For more than 2 decades, he had approached every hearing, conference, and public appearance with the same unwavering discipline that defined his entire legal career. As she moved toward the main entrance, another clerk hurried to meet her. "We still have not reached him," the clerk said, lowering his voice. Margaret accepted the information with a slight nod, but before she could respond, distant voices drifted through the courthouse doors. Outside, the gathering crowd had grown even larger. Television crews had repositioned their cameras. Tourists who originally stopped to admire the architecture now found themselves watching an entirely different kind of history unfold. None of them understood how extraordinary the man standing quietly on the plaza truly was. Isaiah Freeman had never sought public attention. Long before he became one of the nation's most respected jurists, he had built a reputation through patience rather than headlines. Raised in a modest neighborhood where opportunity often depended on determination, he learned early that character was measured by consistency, especially when no one was watching. Scholarships carried him through college. Countless late nights filled with legal research earned him admission to Harvard Law School. Years later, his courtroom arguments became known not for dramatic speeches, but for careful reasoning that earned respect from colleagues across the political spectrum. Even attorneys who disagreed with his conclusions admired the integrity behind every opinion he wrote. Friends often joked that Isaiah listened twice as long as anyone else before speaking half as much. That quiet discipline eventually carried him through the federal judiciary until his nomination to the Supreme Court, where senators from both parties described him as thoughtful, measured, and deeply committed to equal justice under the law. Yet none of those accomplishments were visible to the strangers surrounding him that morning. They saw only a well-dressed black man standing beside several police officers outside one of the most recognizable buildings in America. To many observers, appearance had spoken louder than identity. Isaiah himself seemed almost detached from the growing spectacle. He understood that reputations could be built over decades and questioned within moments. More importantly, he understood that the true strength of the legal system was revealed not when everything functioned perfectly, but when ordinary mistakes were confronted honestly. A light breeze swept across the plaza, lifting the American flag above the courthouse as Isaiah glanced once more toward the entrance. He recognized nearly every face walking through those doors, yet he resisted calling out to anyone. If the truth was going to matter, it needed to emerge through fairness rather than privilege. He would not ask for special treatment simply because of his position. He wanted the same opportunity every citizen deserved, to be heard before being judged. Inside the courthouse, Margaret reached the massive front doors and paused as she noticed several members of the court's security staff looking toward the plaza with unusual concern. One officer quietly pointed outside. She followed his gaze. At first, she saw only a gathering crowd, several police officers, and a familiar navy overcoat standing perfectly still beneath the courthouse steps. Then recognition settled across her face. Her pace quickened instantly. Without raising her voice or drawing attention to herself, she walked directly toward the entrance, unaware that within the next few moments a single sentence would transform confusion into stunned silence. Chief Justice Margaret Sullivan stepped through the courthouse doors just as another wave of murmurs swept across the plaza. She immediately recognized Justice Isaiah Freeman standing several yards away, surrounded by officers and an increasingly anxious crowd. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared on the faces of several courthouse employees. They looked from Isaiah to Margaret and back again, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Margaret descended the wide marble staircase with calm determination, never rushing, never raising her voice. Years on the nation's highest court had taught her that composure often carried greater authority than emotion. Officer Ryan Whitmore noticed her approaching but assumed she was simply another court official curious about the growing disturbance. He nodded politely before returning his attention to Isaiah. "Sir, until we complete this investigation, you will remain here." Isaiah answered with the same quiet dignity he had maintained since the encounter began. "Officer, I have remained exactly where you asked from the very beginning." His words carried no accusation. They were simply true. Nearby, one of the assisting officers shifted uneasily. The longer the encounter continued, the more difficult it became to reconcile Isaiah's calm professionalism with the assumptions that had started the entire situation. Another courthouse employee quietly attempted to move toward the group. "Excuse me," he called. "I believe there has been—" Before he could finish, Whitmore raised a hand. "Please remain behind the perimeter." The employee stopped immediately, exchanging an uneasy glance with another staff member who clearly recognized Isaiah, but hesitated to challenge the officer publicly. It was another missed opportunity to end the misunderstanding before it became something far more serious. Across the plaza, reporters continued broadcasting live updates with very little verified information. Social media clips spread from phone to phone, accompanied by speculation that changed with every new upload. Some viewers defended the officer, insisting there must be facts the public did not yet know. Others questioned why a cooperative man standing peacefully outside the Supreme Court had not even been allowed to identify himself. The unanswered questions multiplied faster than the available facts. Margaret continued walking until she stood only a few feet away from the officers. She first looked at Isaiah, whose expression remained remarkably composed, then at Officer Whitmore. "Good morning, officer," she said politely. Whitmore acknowledged her with a brief nod. "Good morning, ma'am. We are handling an active investigation." Margaret listened carefully before asking a simple question. "May I ask what information this investigation is based upon?" Whitmore explained that the individual matched a description and had raised concerns requiring additional verification. As he spoke, Margaret noticed Isaiah's leather portfolio still resting untouched beside him. She also noticed that he had never once interrupted the officer or attempted to walk away. Every visible fact pointed toward cooperation, yet the encounter had only become more restrictive with time. Isaiah quietly met Margaret's eyes for the first time since she arrived. Neither exchanged greetings. Neither acknowledged one another by title. They understood that any appearance of personal influence at that moment could undermine the very principles both had spent their careers defending. Margaret simply turned back toward Whitmore with the same measured professionalism that had guided decades of judicial service. Around them, cameras continued recording every second. Dozens of witnesses leaned forward in anticipation, sensing that the conversation about to unfold would finally answer the question that had hung over the courthouse all morning. None of them realized that only a single sentence now stood between an ordinary misunderstanding and one of the most expensive failures of public judgment the city would ever face. Chief Justice Margaret Sullivan allowed a brief moment of silence before speaking again. Her voice was calm, measured, and impossible to ignore. "Officer," she said, "before you continue, I would like you to answer one question. Have you confirmed this gentleman's identity?" Ryan Whitmore remained confident. "We are still conducting our investigation, ma'am." Margaret nodded slowly, her expression revealing neither frustration nor approval. "Then I respectfully suggest that you do so immediately." The words seemed simple enough, yet they carried a weight that caused several people nearby to exchange uncertain glances. One of the assisting officers quietly reached for the portable radio on his shoulder, but Whitmore gave a subtle shake of his head, signaling that everything remained under control. Isaiah Freeman stood silently, his attention fixed on neither the cameras nor the growing crowd. Instead, he watched the conversation unfold with remarkable patience. Throughout his career, he had written opinions reminding courts that fairness begins with listening before deciding. Standing outside the very institution where those principles guided the law, he found himself living the lesson instead of teaching it. Margaret turned slightly toward Isaiah and offered the smallest respectful nod. It was the first unmistakable sign that the two knew each other. Several courthouse employees immediately noticed the gesture. One law clerk covered her mouth in disbelief. A federal marshal standing near the entrance straightened almost instinctively as realization began spreading across the courthouse steps. Whitmore frowned. "Ma'am, do you know this individual?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Yes." Another long pause followed. Every camera pointed toward the three figures standing beneath the towering marble columns. The reporters stopped whispering. Even the tourists seemed to hold their breath. Then Margaret delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Officer, this is Justice Isaiah Freeman of the Supreme Court of the United States." For several seconds, nothing happened. The plaza became so quiet that the distant traffic along First Street sounded unusually loud. Whitmore stared at Isaiah as though waiting for someone to contradict what he had just heard. Instead, he saw the faces around him changing one by one. Court employees lowered their eyes. The assisting officers looked toward each other with growing concern. Reporters quickly checked official photographs on their phones, comparing them to the man standing only a few feet away. Every image confirmed exactly what Margaret had said. Isaiah remained composed. He neither celebrated nor expressed resentment. He simply offered a polite greeting. "Good morning, Chief Justice." Margaret returned the greeting with equal professionalism. "Good morning, Justice Freeman." Those few ordinary words carried extraordinary meaning. They erased every remaining doubt without raising a single voice. Whitmore slowly looked back at Isaiah, replaying every decision he had made since the encounter began. The requests he had refused, the explanations he had interrupted, the identification he had never allowed to be presented. What had started as confidence now felt painfully different. One assisting officer quietly stepped backward, lowering his eyes toward the pavement. Another removed his notebook without writing another word. Around them, dozens of witnesses realized they had just watched one of the nation's highest judicial officers spend nearly an hour attempting to identify himself while being denied the opportunity to do so. The cameras continued recording, capturing not anger or celebration, but something far more powerful. They captured the exact moment assumptions collided with reality. And although the silence lasted only a few seconds longer, everyone standing on that plaza would later remember it as the loudest moment of the entire day, because in that silence the truth had finally spoken for itself. News travels differently when it is carried by facts instead of rumors. Within an hour, the videos recorded outside the Supreme Court had spread across television networks, digital newsrooms, and social media platforms throughout the country. Millions of viewers watched the same sequence unfold from multiple camera angles. They saw Justice Isaiah Freeman standing calmly. They heard him politely request the opportunity to identify himself. They watched every missed opportunity to resolve the misunderstanding before it became a national story. Public reaction was immediate, but inside government offices, another process had already begun. Captain Ethan Brooks from Internal Affairs arrived at the scene before noon with a small investigative team. There were no dramatic announcements, no raised voices, only careful documentation. Body camera recordings were secured. Radio communications were preserved. Security footage from the courthouse plaza was requested before any files could be altered or misplaced. Every statement given that morning would be compared against the video evidence frame by frame. Captain Brooks understood that public trust depended not on promises, but on transparency. Justice Freeman cooperated with every request, answering each question with the same thoughtful precision that had defined his years on the bench. He never exaggerated. He never speculated about anyone's motives. When investigators asked him to describe the encounter, he focused only on what had happened, not on what he believed anyone intended. That distinction impressed everyone in the room. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Whitmore sat quietly in an administrative office completing his own written report. For the first time that day, there were no cameras, no spectators, and no assumptions to rely upon. Only facts remained. As he reviewed the timeline, he noticed details that had seemed insignificant during the encounter but now appeared impossible to ignore. Justice Freeman had complied with every instruction. He had requested several opportunities to present identification. Courthouse employees had attempted to intervene. None of those moments had altered the course of events. Outside the building, legal scholars and former judges began discussing the incident on national television. Their conversations centered on procedure, equal treatment, and the importance of verifying identity before reaching conclusions. Civil rights organizations called for an independent review. Law enforcement leaders from across the country emphasized that professionalism requires patience as much as authority. The discussion quickly expanded beyond one courthouse and one officer. Americans from different backgrounds found themselves asking the same uncomfortable question. If this could happen outside the Supreme Court to one of the nation's highest judicial officers, what might happen to an ordinary citizen without public recognition or institutional support? Attorney David Carter met briefly with Justice Freeman later that afternoon. Rather than speaking about punishment, they discussed accountability. Carter explained that the law provided mechanisms to examine both individual decisions and institutional responsibility. Isaiah listened carefully before answering with quiet conviction. "This case cannot be about me alone," he said. "If meaningful change comes from this, then every person who expects fairness under the law benefits." Those words quietly became the foundation for everything that followed. The investigation continued for weeks, gathering testimony from witnesses, reviewing policies, and examining whether the events outside the courthouse reflected isolated mistakes or deeper procedural failures. Long before any courtroom reached a verdict, one truth had already become impossible to dispute. The nation had not simply witnessed an unfortunate misunderstanding. It had witnessed a powerful reminder that justice begins with the willingness to see the individual standing in front of you before allowing assumptions to shape the story. By the time the civil trial began, the conversation had grown far beyond a single morning outside the Supreme Court. Weeks of investigation had produced thousands of pages of documents, hours of synchronized video footage, official radio communications, witness testimony, and departmental records. Every significant moment had been reconstructed with remarkable precision. The courtroom was filled long before the proceedings started. Journalists occupied nearly every available seat. Law students waited along the walls with notebooks in hand. Civil rights advocates, retired judges, former law enforcement officials, and ordinary citizens all came for the same reason. They wanted to see whether the legal system would hold itself to the same standard it expected from everyone else. Attorney David Carter presented the evidence methodically, never relying on emotional language when documented facts spoke far louder. The video recordings showed Justice Isaiah Freeman remaining respectful throughout the encounter. Audio recordings confirmed that he repeatedly requested the opportunity to identify himself. Witnesses testified that courthouse employees had attempted to clarify the misunderstanding before it escalated. Internal affairs investigators explained how multiple opportunities existed to verify identity through standard procedures, yet those opportunities had not been used. Captain Ethan Brooks described the investigation in careful detail, emphasizing that the review focused not only on individual actions, but also on whether existing policies had been properly followed. Experts in law enforcement training testified that professional policing requires observation, communication, verification, and proportional decision-making before conclusions are reached. Several acknowledged that assumptions can influence judgment if officers fail to pause and examine the available facts. The defense argued that Officer Ryan Whitmore believed he was acting in good faith based on the information available to him at the time. No one questioned that officers regularly make difficult decisions under pressure. Yet the central issue before the court was not whether the initial contact had been appropriate. The question was whether repeated opportunities to correct the misunderstanding had been ignored after new information became available. As each witness testified, the timeline became increasingly clear. Every passing minute had offered another chance to slow down, verify identity, and prevent the situation from becoming a national controversy. Justice Freeman eventually took the witness stand. His testimony lasted less than 1 hour. He answered every question with calm precision, avoiding speculation and refusing to criticize anyone personally. When asked why he chose not to immediately announce his position with greater urgency, he paused before responding. The law should protect every person with equal dignity. If fairness depends upon a title, then fairness is incomplete. The courtroom remained silent after those words. They were not spoken with anger or disappointment. They were spoken as a reminder of the principles upon which the legal system had been built. Several days later, the jury returned its unanimous verdict. The court found that the violations established during the proceedings had caused significant legal and personal harm, and that institutional failures had contributed to the outcome. The city was ordered to pay Justice Isaiah Freeman $2.3 million in damages. The judgment also required comprehensive policy reforms, expanded training, and independent oversight designed to strengthen public confidence moving forward. Officer Ryan Whitmore was no longer serving in his previous role, while departmental leadership publicly committed to implementing every recommendation issued through the investigation. As the courtroom slowly emptied, very few people spoke. They understood that the largest number announced that day was not the financial award itself. The greater measure was the value the justice system had placed on accountability, equal treatment, and the responsibility to ensure that the same constitutional protections apply to every individual who stands before the law 1 year later. The marble steps of the United States Supreme Court looked exactly as they had on that unforgettable morning. The towering columns still reflected the first light of day. Tourists still gathered to photograph the historic building. Law clerks still hurried toward the entrance carrying case files that would shape the nation's future. At first glance, nothing had changed. Yet for those who remembered what had happened there, everything felt different. Justice Isaiah Freeman arrived on foot once again, choosing the same route he had taken exactly 1 year earlier. This time, several security officers greeted him with quiet respect before returning to their duties. There was no ceremony waiting for him. No television cameras. No reporters asking questions. The absence of attention felt appropriate. True justice, he often believed, did not require an audience. It required consistency. Inside the courthouse, the reforms ordered after the investigation had become part of daily practice. Verification procedures had been strengthened. Additional training emphasized communication before assumption, observation before conclusion, and dignity before authority. Officers assigned to federal buildings now spent time reviewing the lessons learned from that single morning outside the courthouse. New recruits watched the recordings not to assign blame, but to understand how quickly ordinary decisions could carry extraordinary consequences when facts were replaced by assumptions. Captain Ethan Brooks continued overseeing policy implementation, reminding every class that accountability was not about embarrassing institutions. It was about making them worthy of public trust. Across the country, legal conferences discussed the case as an important example of constitutional responsibility. Universities included it in ethics courses. Police academies referenced it during instruction on professional judgment. Law students debated not only the legal outcome, but also the moral questions it raised. Many concluded that the greatest protection offered by the Constitution was not reserved for the powerful. It existed precisely because ordinary people deserved equal treatment regardless of title, appearance, or circumstance. Justice Freeman never spoke publicly about the financial judgment, except once during a lecture at a law school. A student asked whether the $2.3 million award had brought him satisfaction. Isaiah smiled gently before answering. Money measures damages. It does not measure dignity. The true value of accountability is found in what changes afterward. The room remained silent as students carefully wrote down every word. Months later, Officer Ryan Whitmore accepted responsibility for the decisions that had led to the incident. In a written statement released after the disciplinary process concluded, he acknowledged that professional authority carries an obligation to question assumptions before acting upon them. The statement did not erase what had happened, nor did it undo the consequences. But it became another reminder that meaningful accountability begins with honesty. As another morning session prepared to begin, Chief Justice Margaret Sullivan joined Isaiah near the entrance. For a brief moment, the two colleagues looked across the same plaza where confusion had once overshadowed fairness. Today, people walked freely through the space without noticing its history. Perhaps that was the greatest sign of progress. Justice had quietly returned to doing what it was always meant to do. Isaiah adjusted the portfolio beneath his arm and climbed the courthouse steps once more. Above him, the words "equal justice under law" stood carved into the marble, unchanged by time, politics, or public opinion. He paused for only a moment before continuing inside, knowing that those 4 words were never merely an inscription. They were a promise that demanded to be earned every single day. Because a badge may represent authority, and a courtroom may represent the law, but neither has meaning unless every person is first seen as fully human. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.